Welcome to the Macdownunder Podcast for all Australian Apple computer enthusiasts and collectors.
Welcome to episode 50 of the Macdownunder Podcast. I'm Justin, and thanks for joining me again today. Gee, what a milestone. 50 episodes. I couldn't imagine when we started that we'd actually go this long, over a year now. And I guess I better thank a whole lot of people. Firstly, you for watching. I hope you're still finding it interesting. Let me know down in the comments what you think, if you've got any suggestions for future episodes. But thank you for joining us almost every week for the last 50 weeks. I'd also like to thank all the supporters of the show. There's people behind the scenes, my wife, Matt from the Mac Museum, who you know was in most of the first 30 episodes, and it was really his and my idea to start this up last year. And also thanks to Matt for loaning me lots of gear for photos and other things along the way. Our guest co-hosts, we've had a few on, we'll probably have a few more. Thank you to all of those people because they remain engaged and enthused and talk to me about the show pretty regularly. So thank you to those. It's been a great chance to dust off my collection. I'm doing a bit more of that today, and even great to get some of it working again. And as whilst this stuff may well work, there's all those reefer capacitors in there that I've got to get out, and hopefully I can get that done sometime soon. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've had a chance to go through pretty much every Apple II product. There's one notable that we haven't covered, but we've done pretty much all the official Apple II line. So today, we're going to have a look at a computer, you can see which one it is, that maybe divides the Apple collecting community. There's people that love it, and there's people that hate it. But I love it, and it's the Apple III. We'll also cover our regular collecting news, coming events, and for sale items. Not so many Apple IIIs for sale at the moment. So, on to today's episode. So, by 1978, Apple had commenced with the Apple I in 1976. It had released the Apple II in 1977, and it was time for Apple to look at their next computer. And this was handed to Dr. Wendell Sander, and Steve Wozniak and a whole range of the other designers were still involved. Its code name was Sarah, the daughter's name of Wendell, and this would eventually become the Apple III that some of us have come to love. But even though it was designed starting in 1978, it actually didn't get released or announced until the middle of 1980 and not released until November of 1980. So it was to be the successor of the Apple II line, these ones up here. And it was meant to be targeting the business community because the Apple II was education. The idea was this next one would target business. However, during that development period from 1978 to 1980 when it got released, a few things had happened. Apple had released an updated Apple II, the Apple II Plus, and so it was going gangbusters. Apple had also visited a place called Xerox PARC, which I'm sure a lot of the followers here know about, and had seen the Xerox Alto machine demonstrated, along with a whole range of other things, networking, laser printing, a whole range of things. And so Apple had returned from that visit in 1979 and had started to have some ideas about implementing those things. And not only that, Big Blue, IBM, the mainframe manufacturer, had started making smaller and smaller computers like the 5100, and I'm sure there were rumours out there that it was going to develop its own personal computer because they tried buying Atari. That was one of their ideas. So, in terms of the Apple III, Apple started promoting it in May 1980. And it was in all their marketing materials. And in fact, the Apple In-Depth I've got here from that year, 1980, is that the one? Yes, here it is. It's actually in this version of the Apple In-Depth. And we've talked about that on a previous show. And that's the catalogue that I use to choose my computer. And I got to say, I looked at the Apple III and I thought it looked great. Now, apparently that was the idea. The marketing people, along with Steve Jobs and his design team, came up with a case that they thought looked brilliant, but the engineers weren't necessarily consulted, I believe. Woz has famously said since that it was designed by a committee and the marketers led the design rather than the engineers. Well, I've got to say, I like the look of it, but of course there's some issues, as we know. All right, I like the look of it. The keyboard, it came with a keypad built in. We've talked about that before. The Apple IIs didn't. It was an optional extra, but the Apple III had a keypad built in. It had this standalone keyboard that almost looked as though it was separate. And I believe, from what I've heard, that was one of the early ideas, to have a separate keyboard, which for Apple, in fact, a lot of computers at the time, would have been quite the thing. But in the end, it ended up being joined. And being a bit lower down than the Apple II, it looked a little bit more ergonomic, to me anyway. It had a built-in disk drive. The Apple IIs, of course, you had to buy a disk drive and an interface card, but the Apple III came with a built-in card and a built-in disk drive. But some of the peripherals in the Apple in-depth catalogue from 1980 weren't ready. And in fact, they advertised the Sanyo monitor as the Monitor 3. And they also had the Disk 2 for the Apple III because the casings weren't ready for the disk drives and they hadn't yet received the monitors for the Monitor 3. So apparently this was the Monitor 3 of the day, and this was the Disk 3 in a Disk 2 case. The profile, so the hard drive down here, wasn't even ready until years later. All right, so let's have a look. So the original Apple III from 1980 came with a 6502A processor, very similar to the original Apple II, but this one was running at just under 2 megahertz, so almost double the speed of the original Apple II. Now, RAM. Now, this is where it gets a bit confusing. The documentation's not that clear. There's not too many history pages out there either about the Apple III. But here's the base of this Apple III. And it shows you that there were options for 64K, 96K, or 128K of RAM, at least according to this label. Now, I've heard of 128 and 256, and this machine, in fact, has 256K in it. And with a third-party card, apparently you can get up to 512K RAM. However, I've actually not seen any references to that 512K card. I presume they're out there, but I couldn't find any references to them. Now, inside, they came with 4 expansion slots. Now, they were proprietary to the Apple III, but they were backward compatible with the Apple II slots. Now, this raised concerns with the Apple enthusiasts because the original Apple II came with 7 slots plus the memory slot, whereas the Apple III only came with 4. But I've got to point out that the Apple III came with 40 and 80 columns and upper and lower case built in out of the box. So that's one slot you didn't need to take up from your Apple II. It had a disk port, not only for the internal drive, but it can handle 3 external drives daisy-chained off the back. If you're in your Apple II, that's 2 slots that would have taken up. There's also 2 DB9 serial ports on the back. One for the silent type printer and the second one for your joystick. So the silent type printer, another port that you would have needed in your Apple II. It had RGB colour built in. Straight out the back of the motherboard. Again, that would be another card that you would require in your Apple II. It also came with 4-bit digital audio. Now, mind you, it only had a mono speaker inside, but it did produce 4-bit audio, not just clicks, it actually made tones. And again, in your Apple II, that would be another card. And it came with the RS232C, the DB25 pin, serial port for your modem or whatever, again, on the motherboard, which again, in your Apple II, you would have needed a slot for your super serial card or something similar. So that's a lot of cards that are already built in that your Apple II didn't have and would have required an extra slot for. So given we've got all of that, having 4 slots, in my opinion, was probably reasonable. Although when you start looking at how many slots you needed for some of the accessories, again, later on, maybe it was a bit questionable, but at the time of launch, it seemed to me, at least, to be a good idea. Let's just talk about the rest of the specs for the moment. So the video could do 80 by 24 rows of text, 80 columns and 24 rows, same as the 80 column cards in the Apple II, but this was straight out of the box, no special functions. It had 1 bit at 560 by 192 resolution, but it could do 4-bit colour as well at 280 by 192, hence the RGB port. Early versions even came with a built-in clock. Now, interestingly, Apple then removed it, saying that the chip that they were using was unreliable, if you believe that story. All right, pricing. The basic Apple III, so this box, without the screen, without the extra disk drives, just the box with the disk drive, was a little over 1.5 times the price of an Apple II with a single disk drive and interface card. So it was a very expensive machine. They were available here in Australia, and in fact one of these is a 240 volt version that I did source locally. The others, however, I've had to import, particularly the 3 Plus, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. Now, other than the photos, I had never seen an Apple III when they were on sale. I never played with one, I never used one, I certainly never owned one. But as soon as they started popping up secondhand, I knew I had to have one because of those early days when I was dreaming of having one, but ended up buying an Apple II, which I think in hindsight was probably the wise way to go. But you know, I did feel pretty bad that we couldn't get an Apple III. Now, this one, which is the earliest serial number that I've got, has also an early version of the motherboard with an SK500-06 identifier. Now, it's one of the earlier motherboards. I don't know that it's the first. There's not a lot of documentation out there. But it has clearly been upgraded for 5-volt memory because it's got 5-volt memory in it. I suspect it would have come with the fairly rare now and heating and hot 12-volt RAM, but mine's been upgraded. The sticker says 128K, so it's clearly been upgraded because it's got 256K of RAM in it. Now, to do the upgrade on the motherboard, you had to swap 2 chips at C11 and C13, and you needed to clip a resistor and do some soldering changes on the motherboard. So not for the faint of heart, it was definitely a dealer or a return service. Now, those 12-volt RAM chips did generate a lot of heat, and heat is the enemy of the Apple III. There's a whole range of stories, some of them true, some of them not so true, about the heat in the Apple III and its design. It is true, it does not come with a fan, although one of mine has got a third-party retrofitted fan that it came with. And it definitely was built to be a heatsink. So looking at the back of it, it is absolutely a heatsink on the back, and in fact the whole chassis is metal for conducting the heat to the heatsink. It is true that there was an Apple technical note suggesting that if your Apple III became unreliable, to lift the keyboard end 3 inches off the table and drop it to reset the chips. That actually did happen. You don't need to do it with any of the newer machines, but that first series, potentially, you did need to. And I've got to say, having taken these apart to access the motherboards for some of these photos, I've got to say that is far preferable than taking the motherboard out, popping off the memory card and reseating all the chips individually, although I have done that myself here. Either way, there were issues with the motherboard as well, apparently. So some of the online content suggests that the early versions of the board had very narrow traces, and this potentially led to short circuits happening across the narrow traces that were too close together. So there was a recall. The first 14,000 Apple IIIs apparently got recalled and replaced. And in 1981, a revised motherboard was released. And in fact, this model, this particular computer here is in the 100,000 mark, serial number, and has this motherboard, which is still copyright 1980, but goes by the identifier of 820.0043.00E. And so clearly a newer motherboard with a different modelling number system, and does look to have some slight variations in its configuration. I do notice though that this one comes with a third-party aftermarket clock chip from On3. See if you can spot it in the photo. Now it's also got 256K of RAM, and in 1981 finally the plastic was available for the Monitor 3, and the Monitor 3 was available, and the plastic was available for the Disc 3s as well. And as you can see, they colour-coded. It was the first monitor Apple actually produced, and clearly made it because the side profile and the dimensions were specifically to fit on the Apple III. However, you can tell the marketers might have been involved here and didn't think too much about the engineering, because you, as you can see right here, I did this deliberately, you cannot fit 3 disk drives underneath your monitor or nicely spread on top of your Apple III. So I suspect if an engineer was designing a computer that could have 3 external disk drives, they'd make it wide enough to accommodate them in the stacking design, because these are clearly designed to stack on top of an Apple III. Okay, in 1981, the profile hard drive down here was also available at the same time as these other products. So the profile hard drive, 5 megabytes or 10 megabytes, was available for your Apple III, but you did need a profile interface card. So not a cheap proposition, but you could add a hard drive to your 1981 or your earlier 1980 version of your Apple III. Now, let's just talk about the operating system for a moment. The Apple III came with a new operating system at the time. It was the Apple III SOS, standing for Sophisticated Operating System. I believe the Americans called it Apple Sauce, but yeah, I'm probably a sauce person myself. Now, it wasn't compatible with DOS 3.3 that was running on your Apple II. And the DOS 3.3 on the Apple II was a disk operating system. All it could do was talk to the disk drives. It didn't really do anything else. But the sophisticated operating system for the Apple III was pretty great for its time. It came with device drivers. So it had drivers to enable your silent type printer and other types of printer, your hard drives, your floppy drives. In fact, even the Duo disk that came out for the Apple II could work in an Apple III with the appropriate drivers. In fact, a lot of Apple II interface cards could plug into an Apple III provided you had the right device driver for Apple SOS. SOS also came with a hierarchical filing system. Now, this is a bit to do with the disk drives, but the hierarchical file system meant that you could have basically what we come to know as folders. The Apple II was a flat operating system, so everything was in the root directory, whereas SOS allowed you to put in subdirectories or folders and store files in a hierarchy. Pretty unique, and absolutely a requirement once you had a hard disk. And it also came with a program chooser. Now, Apple was developing its own called Selector, which didn't go so well. And so in the end, they ended up shipping Quark Catalyst, so made by Quark, third party, Catalyst, which was a program chooser. So when you boot your Apple III, you actually can't boot into a DOS command prompt. What you either do is boot into a program like Quark, which then allowed you to select from the programs either on your hard drive or on that floppy drive. What else could the Apple III do? Well, it did have an Apple II emulator in it. Because it was a 6502, it was hardware compatible with the original Apple II. However, what they did is the Apple II emulator, which was software, was limited to running Apple II Plus software. So it was consistent with Apple II Plus with 48K of RAM. Now, some of you, and a lot of you will know, that Apple IIs could easily take 64K. And That was the base specification for the Apple III. So that was a bit of a limitation. And in fact, I've seen another YouTuber with a video with their Apple III where they tried to boot a game program on their Apple III only to find out that the game needed all 64K that the Apple II Plus was capable of and wouldn't run in the Apple II emulator because it didn't allow enough RAM in emulation. However, this emulation did allow for a transition period, so you could take your software from your Apple II onto your Apple III, remembering though that the file system wasn't compatible, but you could still use it, provided it would work on your Apple II Plus. However, mixed reports, your mileage might vary. Okay, now in December 1983, 11 months after the Apple IIe was launched, that we talked about last week, Apple released the Apple III Plus, this one here. It came with a revised motherboard. I'll put a picture up. It came with a built-in clock, whereas there was an option previously. It came with video interlacing, so it was an upgrade in the electronics there. It unified the port arrangements, so it introduced DB ports, all with screw locks available, which the previous ones were just a plug. And the Disk 3 interface is actually a IDC26. Whereas on the 3 Plus, they're using a DB25. So in fact, to plug your Disk 3s into your Apple III Plus, you needed a special adapter. And in fact, this one's got that adapter attached so that it can work on a 3 Plus. What else did it have? It came with a new keyboard, and you can see the two keyboards side by side. So it's a lighter shade of keyboard, however, much more reminiscent of the Apple IIe that had been released only earlier the same year. And you'll also notice that they upgraded the monitor 3. So this isn't faded. This is actually a lighter shade of the brown to match the keyboard for the Apple III Plus. So yes, so the accessories were released matching the Apple III. So in September 1985, the Apple III line was discontinued. There's an estimate of 120,000 machines being produced. Now that's kind of interesting because I've got a serial number in the hundreds of thousands. So I think that might be a bit off, but that's the estimate. And it's surprising that the Apple III actually lived that long, given the huge troubles that it had early on with 14,000 machines having to be returned. It was still seen to be quite limited by a lot of people. However, there are the advocates for the Apple III, and I certainly love my Apple IIIs. I really need to get them working so I can put them through their paces, but there's programming languages available and there's plenty of software available for business and so forth. Not so much in the gaming space. So that means in 1985, we still had the Apple IIe, we had the Apple III, we had the Lisa, and we had the Mac. In fact, we had the Mac 512 available in 1985. So that's 4 platforms, 4 different computers running 4 different operating systems. And this was in 1985. And they reckon 1990 was the failure of Apple. I think the writing was on the wall with the variations that they had back in 1985. Mind you, I love them all, and I'm sure you do too, because you're here watching this. Okay, there were some issues with the Apple III. It is interesting to notice that the Apple III software, at least early on, was all co-branded. So I don't know whether there was a licensing deal going on, but there was VisiCalc, there was a whole range of other software which was actually co-branded by Apple. And I suspect that probably increased the cost. Same with the hardware. The Apple released some Apple III interface cards, and here's a picture of serial card, parallel card. This one's actually at the Mac Museum. The profile interface card, and even this fairly rare card that I've got, which is for the failed Twiggy drive, Uni drive, and Duo drive, all Apple branded. But there was also the Titan IIe card. So you could actually put a set of cards. In fact, I believe there were 2 cards into your Apple III, and that would emulate the hardware of an Apple IIe, breaking the problem with the Apple II emulation in software. But they were co-branded by Apple as well. And Microsoft had a Z80 CPM, the card that could run CPM, and it was co-branded by Apple. So I think that sounds a lot like what Nintendo does today. Everything has to be Nintendo branded. I wonder whether Apple had that idea in mind. It certainly looks that way. We've spoken about the heat issues, and obviously with the IBM PC coming out, carving up the market with 4 different platforms, the Apple III sadly didn't do so well. Now, what about the legacy of the Apple III? Well, it came with built-in ports. We've covered those already. And that paved the way, I guess, for the Apple IIc that only came with external ports. The Apple IIgs, a bit like the Apple III, that comes with ports and or slots, depending on the user. The Lisa, again, came with built-in ports as well as slots. And of course, the Mac famously originally only came with the built-in ports. No user access available, or so they thought, until we all got hold of Torx screwdrivers. Eventually, the Mac 2 would resolve that, and the Mac SE. So built-in ports, I think, is a bit of a legacy of the Apple III. It's the first time Apple actually started to do that. On the keyboard, we've got the open and closed Apple keys. They were introduced in the Apple III. Same with the 4 cursor keys. The original Apple II just had left and right. The Apple III came with up and down as well. Now, those open and closed Apple keys went across into the Apple IIe, and they continued on and evolved into what we now know as the Command and Option keys. So a great legacy from the Apple III that lasts right through to today's keyboards. The sophisticated operating system. Well, I mentioned how great it was, but it was restricted to the Apple III. Well, it evolved into ProDOS for the Apple II. For those Apple II enthusiasts, you know about ProDOS. It was also used in 16-bit on the Apple II GS, and made its way into the Lisa operating system and the Mac operating system as well. And you might remember in a previous episode where I've talked about storage solutions, when Apple introduced their first hard drive, this one in fact, or second hard drive actually, the HD20. When they introduced the HD20 for the Mac 512, they needed a hierarchical file system because the Mac file system wasn't. It was like the Apple II, it was flat. Everything was in the root of your floppy disk. So they needed a hierarchical file system. Where did they get it from? They ported it out of the sophisticated operating system from the Apple III. So what a fantastic legacy from the sophisticated operating system. And in software, there's some legacy as well. I'll pick out one piece in particular, slip of the tongue. I'll pick out one application in particular called 3 Easy Pieces. It was third-party software, and it provided you with a word processor, a spreadsheet, and a database. So 3 applications in one. Where have we seen that before? Well, this was back in the 1980s. That piece of software eventually got bought by Apple, and it turned into what we might remember as AppleWorks for the Apple II. AppleWorks then evolved for the 2GS in a GUI and was implemented within the Mac operating system, the Mac platform as well. So 3 Easy Pieces, a business application written specifically for the Apple III, ended up on our Macs and probably influenced Lisa Office as well, although there's no direct connection. And clearly paved the way for Apple's Pages and Numbers applications that we're using today. So I think the Apple III is wonderful. I love it. Some hate it. What about you? Have you got an Apple III in your collection? Do you have a few Apple IIIs in your collection? Do you still use them? I know there's a working one down in the Mac Museum, so we'll talk about the next open day shortly, but there is a working Apple III down in the Mac Museum, so if you want to see one in action and have a play, get down there for one of their open days. But do you have an Apple III? Do you use it? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. On to recent news, and R&R Auctions over in the US have another one of their 50 years of Apple auction. Plenty of items there if you're interested, but a couple that I thought I'd bring your attention to. Firstly, they've got another Apple One available. This one's a genuine one, and it comes in a Smith Corona typewriter case. But it is a genuine Apple One, complete with cassette deck, with the cassette I/O card, everything you would need. Currently at $154,000 American. And don't forget there's a buyer's premium, and then you need to get it shipped here to Australia as well. The next thing I thought that was interesting, we've talked about this just recently and I don't have one. This is an Apple II computer. It's the early Rev Zero board and it's in the ventless case. So this was one of the first couple of hundred that were hand sanded and hand painted, and the ventless case, which was really quite unique. Currently at $1,331 US. That's actually not a bad price for one of these, but I suspect it will go for more. Their estimate is $30,000 US. So, well, get in early while you can. I did bid on this one when it was previously listed, but of course I did not win it. All right, there's also a Lisa one available. This one's currently at $6,655 American dollars. Of course, it will go for more than that. Their estimate is $60,000 US, and then you've got shipping as well. But again, affordable at the moment. If you're interested in a Lisa one, try out the auction. Now, back to today's theme, the Apple III. So they've got two Apple IIIs. This one's an original Apple III, but it's missing a few things. So it's missing its keyboard. It's looking a bit sad. It's got some cracks in the case, but currently no bids and starting bid at $200. So if you can afford the shipping, not a bad thing. All right, the next one is an Apple III Plus, complete with software, documentation, etc. This one still no bid, starting at $500. But this is the slightly rarer Apple III Plus with the color-coded matching monitor. So definitely something worth having a look at over at R&R Auctions. But remember, there is a dealer's premium, and a buyer's premium, I should say, and you're locked into their shipping arrangements, which I've experienced previously. So make sure you do your research. Next up, Kansas Fest 2026 have got their presentations online on YouTube. And the one I was wanting to watch is there and available. It's the typical sort of presentation from a user seminar, link down in the description. But this one is about Apple's school bus, the precursor to Apple Talk. And so there is a demonstration and link in the description. And of course, Kansas Fest virtual sessions are on this weekend. Link for Kansas Fest virtual sessions in the description as well. On to coming events. And first up, we've got WasFest. Their next session, because their last one was just last weekend, their next session is on the 26th of September. Again, in a private home or possibly online. Check with the organisers, link in the description. The Adelaide Retro Computing Group have their next meeting on Friday the 14th of August from 5:30 in the Unley Community Centre in South Australia. The Mac Museum have their next open day on the 8th of August from 10 a.m. till 2 p.m. Note that there's a new membership scheme in place and seems to be quite popular. And also, don't forget, they have an Apple III that's working on display. So if you liked today's discussion about Apple IIIs, get down there on the 8th of August and have a look at the Mac Museum's Apple III in action. Link in the description. Technology Markets have their next session this Sunday, the 2nd of August, at the Darebin Community Sports Stadium in Reservoir. This is going to have a retro tech display as well. Sadly, I don't think I'm going to be able to get there. However, if you're interested, get along there on Sunday. And the Retro Gaming Bendigo Group have their next session this Saturday, the 1st of August, 12 o'clock for a 12:30 start in the Huntley Memorial Hall, just near Bendigo, Victoria. Link in the description. And if you have a retro computing event, particularly one that has something about Apple computers in it, please reach out, let me know, and I'd be happy to include it in our list here. Next up, for sale items. Well, I've covered all the Apple III that's for sale at the R&R auctions, so I'll leave that alone because there's no Apple IIIs available for sale in Australia that I can find. However, there is this Apple IIe. It's a beige version and it's in New South Wales, currently on auction for $1. Now, it apparently provided smoke when it was turned on. That's not unusual coming from the reefer caps. So some little bit of work might be required to get it working. It is missing some keys, but at $1, you can't go wrong. Link in the description. Next up, from the same seller, they've got a Platinum 2E, currently at $2.25, also in New South Wales on auction. Now, this one is missing the power supply and a few other things. It does have a mouse card and a couple of other cards in it. Again, at $2.25 currently, it's a bit of a bargain. Next up, an Apple II Euro Plus. Now, we covered these just recently in the show. This one has two floppy disk drives as well. It's not been tested. The power supply has been taken apart and will probably need some expert work. But this relatively rare machine with disk drives and a disk drive card is currently available in South Australia for $425 on auction. The same seller also has the matching Sanyo CRT monitor. Again, will likely need some restoration. It's looking a bit rough in the photos, but you don't see these come up in Australia very much at all. And even in the US, they're pretty expensive. This one's in South Australia currently at $485 Australian on auction, but it will need some work. Well, that brings us to the end of episode 50 of the Macdownunder podcast. Again, thanks to everyone that's been involved, and thank you for tuning in and watching me on YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching. Now, what should we cover next week? What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. And until I see you next time, take care. Thank you for joining the Macdownunder podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.